far. If you want to learn to code, you won't get far without becoming comfortable with conditional statements. These are also known as if and else statements, and the name conditional comes from the fact that you will do one thing on the condition that something is true, and on the condition that it's false, you'll go a different direction. So conditionals, if and else statements, are one of the most basic units of decision making that you'll use in almost every program you write, hundreds of times probably. They allow you to choose to go one direction or another, which makes your code a lot more flexible. We're going to do this in our first example, so let's just jump right in. I've provided a basic example of a conditional using both an if and an else statement. You don't always have to use these two together. You can just have an if statement, but you can't use an else alone. If can be alone, else can't be alone. So what I'm doing here is I'm just creating a variable, an integer variable called num, and I'm setting it equal to 0, and then I'm checking to see if num is equal to 0. And if it is equal to 0, I print number is equal to 0. And if it is not, hence the else, then it prints number is not equal to 0. So this is the basic syntax, how you use an if statement and how you use an else statement. So please note that. Note how I'm using the brackets, and note that I'm using two equal signs in here, and that's important. We'll come back to that later. So if I run this code, it says number is equal to 0, as I expected. But if I change 0 to something else, like 1, number is not equal to 0. I want to take a moment to focus on the part of the code that says num equals 0, reminding you that we use two equal signs for comparisons, one equal signs to assign a value. So if it's one equal sign, that means that you're giving a variable a value, but here we're checking it. I referred to this as the Boolean expression earlier, and I want to explain what that means. A Boolean expression is anything that can be simplified, somehow into either true or false. So here's a brief demonstration of how the Java compiler, which is what checks your code for errors, builds it, and then actually runs your code, works. The way that the compiler would read your code, or the code that we have here, is when it looks at the num equals 0 part, it reads that as a question. That's what the two equal signs means. As I said earlier, it's different from the single equal sign. So it takes the 0 that we have right here, and it plugs that in for num. So basically what the compiler is reading is 0 equals 0, and that's true. 0 is equal to 0. And then from there, we could move to our other example, which is int num equals 1, and it would do the exact same thing. Again, plug in 1 for num, and it would ask 1 equals 0, and that would be false. So again, a Boolean expression is either going to be true or false. There are other Boolean expressions besides the double equal sign, and if you have a basic familiarity with math, you may recognize them. So before we talk about anything more complicated, let's introduce the basic idea of the else-if statement, which I have in this example. So notice how the else here doesn't have any parentheses. You won't use parentheses with else statements, but if it's an else-if, because of the if, you do need a parentheses, because again, if statements are attached always to a condition, which we call the Boolean expression. The last comment I want to make here about else-if statements is that I want you to think about these as a train. Basically, all of these are attached together. This is all one unit. So you can do if, else-if, 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 else. And only one of those can be true. Only one of those will be selected and print. So if the number is equal to 0, it's gonna, we're gonna print number is equal to 0, and then immediately skip down to the end here. If that's not true, then we look at the else if statement, and if that's true, again, we go down to the end. And if the first two are not true, then the else is basically saying, all right, any other number is going to satisfy this condition. If you have any questions about how conditionals like if, and else work, please let me know below in the comments, and I'll happily answer your question. If you have no questions, then please check out my next video. You can see the code down here for that, where we will look at more complex Boolean expressions, like less than, greater than, less than or equal to, and we'll also talk about comparing strings instead of integers. So I hope to see you again. Bye now.